Welcome to Whispers of History, where forgotten tales, strange events, and mysterious moments from the past come alive. One whisper at a time. Subscribe, relax, and let the past whisper you to sleep. Imagine yourself reclining gently, the day's noise slowly fading into the background. We are about to step softly into the quiet corridors of history, places where traditions were not yet fixed, where even something as seemingly eternal as the white wedding gown was still just an idea waiting to be born, long before bridal shops filled with satin and lace, long before glossy magazines taught couples what to wear. Weddings were far simpler things. The bride's gown was not necessarily white. In fact, it was rarely so. Women married in their best clothing, sometimes red, sometimes green, sometimes patterned with flowers or embroidered with golden thread, and then, in the 19th century, a young queen made a choice. Not a decree, not a command, but a personal choice that would ripple across oceans and centuries. This queen, Victoria of England, wore white silk satin on the day she married Prince Albert in 1840. Her gown was not adorned with jewels, nor stitched with extravagance. It was, instead, striking in its purity and simplicity. The world took notice. And so began the story of the wedding dress code, an unspoken tradition that millions follow even now, often without realizing they are echoing the footsteps of a queen. Close your eyes for a moment, and picture a wedding centuries before the Victorian age. There are no glossy photographs, no magazines to dictate a style, no royal examples to follow. What you see is a celebration deeply tied to community and family, not fashion. Brides often wore garments they already owned. For some, it might be a fine wool gown saved for festivals, dyed in deep shades of green or burgundy. For others, especially among the wealthy, it might be a silk dress in blue or gold, richly embroidered, handed down through generations. White, in fact, was considered impractical. It showed stains too easily and lacked the permanence of darker, stronger colors, in medieval Europe. Colors themselves carried meanings. Red, the shade of passion and life, was a favored choice. Blue, associated with the Virgin Mary, symbolized fidelity and faith. Green suggested fertility and renewal. These colors, rich and symbolic, adorned brides for centuries without a second thought. Imagine now a peasant wedding in a small English village. The bride wears her best woolen dress, perhaps patched, perhaps simple, but carefully washed for the occasion. Her hair is crowned with flowers, a token of natural beauty. The groom might wear his work tunic, polished boots, and nothing more. It was not the fabric that mattered, but the union itself. Among the aristocracy, gowns could be opulent displays of family wealth. Brocades heavy with gold thread, silks imported from Italy or the East, and jewels sewn into sleeves turned the bride into a walking testament of her family's status. There was no single style, no single color, only variety. This freedom of choice is something we might find surprising today. In an era where nearly every bride is expected to wear white, it feels almost dreamlike to imagine weddings filled with a rainbow of gowns. Yet for centuries, this was the norm. Weddings were as diverse as the communities themselves. And so, as we linger here in this past world of colorful fabrics and unspoken traditions, we prepare to step gently toward the moment when one queen's gown would begin to change it all. As we leave behind the village squares and the Renaissance halls of Segment 1, let us drift a little further forward, into the threshold of the modern world. Imagine yourself walking softly through centuries of changing fashion, and yet finding one constant: there was still no single wedding dress code. Each bride chose what she had, what she loved, or what her family could afford. In many parts of Europe, wedding garments were considered investments. A bride's dress was not made for a single day, but for years of use afterward. A finely tailored gown might serve as both a wedding dress and a garment for festivals, feasts, and even formal appearances. The practicality of such choices reflected the rhythm of life, durable, functional, and meaningful. For wealthier families, the garments could become showcases of national pride. In Scandinavian countries, brides sometimes wore dresses stitched with silver thread and intricate embroidery reflecting local motifs. In Russia, ornate headdresses known as kokoshniks were paired with richly woven gowns. In Spain, black lace mantillas gave a solemn dignity to the marriage ceremony. There was, however, one element that often tied these different traditions together: the desire for symbolism. Even if colors and fabrics varied, weddings carried layers of meaning in every stitch. A blue sash might symbolize loyalty. A wreath of myrtle in the hair might suggest fertility. A veil, whether in lace or linen, might signify modesty. In England, for instance, brides in the 18th century often wore gowns of silver or pale pastel shades, considered elegant and refined, suitable for both weddings and court appearances. White, still, was unusual. It was worn occasionally by wealthy brides, but more often as a display of affluence, since maintaining white fabric was costly and impractical for most households. Meanwhile, in rural communities, the spirit was different. Weddings were not so much about fashion, but about union and continuity. A bride might wear her mother's gown, refitted with new trimmings, or a garment dyed with local plants. In this way, the past and present were woven together through fabric, stitching memory into the very seams of the celebration. So you see, before Queen Victoria stepped into her chapel at St. James's Palace, the world of weddings was painted in many shades, stitched with countless traditions. The white gown had not yet become the emblem of purity or beauty. It was merely one color among many, waiting quietly in the background, and it is here, in this world of choice and variety, that history prepares to meet the singular influence of a queen whose decision would reshape the imagination of brides for generations to come. The 19th century was a time of immense transformation. Factories rose with their tall chimneys, trains cut across the countryside with a sense of urgency, and newspapers spread news faster than ever before. And yet, amid all this noise of progress, a young woman emerged upon the throne of England who would carry with her not just the weight of empire, but also the subtle influence of fashion, ceremony, and tradition. This was Queen Victoria. When she ascended the throne in 1837, Victoria was only 18 years old. Young, determined, and in many ways inexperienced, she represented both continuity and change. The country, accustomed to kings with stern faces and heavy crowns, now looked to a small woman who seemed more relatable than regal. It was precisely this relatability, this humanity, that would shape her influence, especially in matters beyond politics. Victoria's upbringing had been both sheltered and strict. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, had kept her under what was known as the Kensington system, a highly controlled childhood designed to keep her dependent and pliable. Yet, the young Victoria was far from weak. She possessed a quiet strength, an independent streak that showed itself the moment she became queen. In her early reign, she rejected much of her mother's influence and asserted her authority as monarch. This independence would extend into her personal life as well, particularly in her choice of husband. When Victoria met Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg in Gotha, it was not merely a marriage of politics, it was a union of affection, admiration, and genuine love. At this time in history, royal marriages were often viewed as strategic alliances. A queen or princess might be expected to marry a man chosen for political gain, not personal preference. But Victoria, even in her role as sovereign, claimed her right to love. She proposed to Albert herself, since royal protocol forbade him from proposing to her. It was a moment of quiet defiance and tender boldness, traits that would define her reign and her choices. The people adored this story. Newspapers circulated tales of Victoria's love and devotion, making her seem almost like one of them. For a queen who ruled over an empire spanning continents, this image of sincerity and relatability was both powerful and endearing. As Victoria prepared for her wedding, she was faced with decisions about attire and ceremony. Unlike kings and queens before her, who had often turned weddings into displays of opulence, Victoria leaned toward simplicity and symbolism. This decision was deeply tied to her personality. She was not ostentatious. She preferred to surround herself with sentiment rather than grandeur. Her wedding to Albert was not just a royal event, it became a public spectacle. The people, already captivated by her youth and love story, longed to know every detail. What gown would she wear? What flowers would she choose? These questions filled the air of England with gentle anticipation. It is important to remember that, until this moment, brides across Europe had no single rule to follow. They wore colors, fabrics, and designs dictated by family, region, or wealth. But Victoria's decision would soon shift this entire landscape. She chose not silver, not gold, not crimson or blue, but white. Her gown was crafted from silk satin, woven in Spitalfields, a district of London known for its weavers. The lace was handmade in Honiton, a small town in Devon, supporting local craft at a time when industrial machines threatened such trades. By choosing these materials, Victoria not only shaped fashion but also supported national industry. This choice of white was unusual but not entirely unprecedented. Wealthy brides had occasionally worn white before, though more as a display of status than symbolism. What made Victoria's choice different was her sincerity. She framed her gown not as a statement of wealth, but as a declaration of purity, simplicity, and devotion to her husband. The message resonated deeply, and when images of her gown spread, through illustrations, engravings, and eventually photographs, something shifted in the cultural imagination. Suddenly, white was not just a color. It was the color. The press coverage surrounding her wedding was immense. Every aspect of the ceremony was described in detail, from the music played to the flowers chosen. For the first time, the public could follow along with a royal wedding almost as if they were present. This marked the beginning of the public royal wedding as we know it today, where the people share in the intimacy of the monarch's private life. Victoria's personal influence extended far beyond her gown. Her marriage to Albert became a model of devotion. Though they were royals, their life together was often portrayed as domestic, filled with children, gardens, and shared interests. This vision of a happy marriage was broadcast across the empire, encouraging ordinary people to idealize not just love, but the ceremony that began it. It is here, in her youth and in her wedding, that we see the roots of her cultural power. Victoria did not invent the white wedding gown outright, but she gave it meaning and visibility at a moment when media could spread it widely. Her choice became a seed, planted in the fertile soil of the public imagination, which would grow into tradition. In the years that followed, aristocrats began to imitate her. Brides who could afford it chose white gowns. Dressmakers began to advertise white silk as the fashionable choice for weddings. Lace makers prospered from the sudden demand. And slowly, the practice trickled down to the middle class, and eventually to nearly everyone. But in 1840, none of this was yet certain. In that quiet moment when Victoria walked down the aisle in her white gown, it was simply a bride making a personal choice. The ripples would spread later. For now, the world only watched in awe, unaware that history itself was quietly changing. Her youth and her sincerity gave her power. People wanted to emulate her not because she commanded it, but because she inspired it. And in this, she became not only a queen of politics and empire, but a queen of tradition, shaping the lives of ordinary people in ways she might never have imagined. As we reflect on her choices, it becomes clear that her influence was not loud or forceful. It was quiet, gentle, yet enduring. Like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of her decision spread slowly but persistently, reaching far beyond her time. Her wedding marked a shift, but it was only the beginning. What began with a gown would soon expand to flowers, veils, etiquette, and an entire culture of weddings. Victoria had lit the candle, and the world was ready to follow its glow, and so we leave this segment with the image of a young queen, stepping softly yet decisively into history. Not with a command, but with a choice. Not with a decree, but with a gown. When Queen Victoria awoke on the morning of her wedding day, February 10, 1840, London was blanketed in a light mist. The city hummed with anticipation, as though the cobblestones themselves were waiting to witness history. For the young queen, it was not only a day of union with Prince Albert, but also a day where personal choice would quietly reshape cultural tradition. Her gown, laid out in preparation, seemed almost unassuming by royal standards. Yet in its understated beauty lay a revolution. Unlike the golden robes of earlier monarchs or the jeweled gowns of aristocracy, Victoria's wedding dress was crafted from white silk satin, trimmed with delicate Huntington lace, and paired with a simple wreath of orange blossoms. The silk was woven in Spitalfields, a district of London renowned for its master weavers. By choosing British silk rather than foreign imports, Victoria sent a subtle but powerful message of patriotism and support for national industry. This was not mere fashion, it was economy, symbolism, and identity wrapped in cloth. The lace, meanwhile, was painstakingly made by hand in Huntington, a small town in Devon. Dozens of lace makers worked by candlelight, their bobbins clicking gently as intricate patterns emerged thread by thread. By wearing their lace, Victoria helped revive a struggling craft that faced decline in the face of industrial machinery. Her gown thus became not only a garment, but a lifeline for artisans whose livelihoods depended on royal patronage. What made the gown remarkable was its simplicity. In a time when royals often used clothing to emphasize wealth, power, and authority, Victoria's gown was striking precisely because it was not ostentatious. There were no jewels sewn into the bodice, no elaborate embroidery in gold. Instead, the whiteness of the fabric spoke for itself. For centuries, white had been considered impractical. It stained easily, was costly to maintain, and served little purpose in a world where dresses were reused many times. Yet Victoria embraced its impracticality. She wore white not because it was convenient, but because it was meaningful. In doing so, she transformed the color into a symbol. The symbolism of white was not entirely new. It had long been associated with purity, innocence, and virtue. But Victoria's choice gave these associations a living embodiment, reinforced by the visual power of a queen seen by millions through newspapers, engravings, and eyewitness accounts. Her gown became a story told across the nation. When she arrived at St. James's Palace, the effect was immediate. The crowd fell silent at the sight of her white dress, gleaming softly in the winter light. Some described her as angelic, others, as a vision of modesty. In that moment, the gown was no longer fabric. It was an idea. The wreath of orange blossoms in her hair was another deliberate choice. Instead of a heavy crown or a tiara of diamonds, Victoria chose natural flowers. Orange blossoms had long symbolized fertility and eternal love. By wearing them, she conveyed her personal devotion to Albert and her desire for a marriage built on sincerity rather than spectacle. This small detail deeply touched the public. It suggested that beneath her crown, she was still a woman in love, a bride like any other. It was this relatability, this quiet humanity, that made her gown so powerful. Inside the chapel, the dress shimmered under the filtered light of stained glass. The lace veil trailed behind her, carried by 12 bridesmaids also dressed in white, creating a vision of purity that filled the sacred space. The gown, though simple, commanded attention because it defied expectation. Observers recorded the event with awe. The Illustrated London News printed engravings of the Queen's attire, while pamphlets and broadsides circulated descriptions of the fabric, lace, and flowers. Unlike previous royal weddings, this was not just a court affair, it was a public narrative, shared and consumed across all classes of society. The dress also carried economic resonance. Lace makers in Huntingdon credited Victoria's choice with reviving their trade. Demand for lace surged as brides across the country sought to imitate her style. White silk, too, gained prominence in bridal fashion. What had once been the preserve of a queen became the aspiration of countless women. Still, we must not forget the gown's quietness. It was not about dazzling display, but about subtle symbolism. In this way, it reflected Victoria's own character, modest, earnest, yet deeply influential. She was not the most flamboyant of monarchs, but she was among the most enduring. Her gown, like her reign, would become a fixture of cultural memory, returning again and again in conversations about tradition. Love and ceremony. As years passed, the influence of her gown grew. Aristocratic brides imitated her. Dressmakers began advertising white bridal gowns as the fashionable standard. The association of white with purity solidified, reinforced by countless illustrations of Victoria's wedding reprinted throughout the 19th century. The simplicity of her gown also contrasted sharply with the excesses of previous royal weddings. Where once monarchs had sought to overwhelm with gold and jewels, Victoria chose to inspire with humility. It was this humility that resonated with ordinary people, for they saw in her a reflection of themselves. Even as she sat upon a throne, even Albert was deeply moved by her appearance. Accounts describe him gazing at her with visible emotion, touched by the sincerity of her choices. The gown was not only a statement to the world, it was a message to him. In its lace and blossoms, Victoria had woven her love, her fidelity, and her hope for their shared future, and so, what began as a single decision, choosing white silk satin, transformed into a tradition that still endures. Today, when brides step into white gowns, many may not realize they are echoing Victoria's choice. Yet the connection lingers, quiet and persistent, like a whisper across centuries. Her wedding gown was not the grandest in history, nor the most ornate. But it was, perhaps, the most influential. A bold simplicity that reshaped the imagination of love and marriage for generations to come. In the months and years following Queen Victoria's wedding, the white silk gown and Huntingdon lace veil became more than a memory, they became a cultural conversation. Across England and far beyond, people wrote about, imitated, and debated what the Queen had worn. It was as though a single dress had rippled outward, weaving itself into the fabric of society. The choice of lace, in particular, carried a meaning that extended well beyond decoration. Lace had always been valued as a luxury textile, but Victoria's embrace of delicate Huntingdon lace transformed it into something more personal, almost sacred. It was no longer just ornament, it was purity made visible. The idea of lace as purity was not accidental. Its fragile, openwork design suggested delicacy, refinement, and innocence. When paired with the stark whiteness of Victoria's silk, the lace veil seemed to symbolize a bride stepping into marriage unmarked, untouched, and ready to begin anew. For Victorian society, steeped in notions of morality, chastity, and the ideal of the angel in the house, this symbolism resonated deeply. The Queen's choice aligned seamlessly with cultural expectations of feminine virtue, reinforcing the link between clothing and character. At the same time, the veil carried another meaning. In Christian tradition, veils had long been associated with sacredness, covering that which was holy until the moment of revelation. By lifting the veil, the groom symbolically revealed the bride to himself, as though opening a gift. Victoria's lace veil, trailing down her gown, was not only beautiful but also charged with layers of meaning that resonated with both religion and romance. Newspapers and engravings spread images of her veil across the country. The Illustrated London News described the lace as a work of exquisite delicacy, while local pamphlets praised it as proof of British craftsmanship. The effect was immediate. Orders for lace surged, especially from Huntington, whose struggling economy suddenly blossomed. Brides who could afford it commissioned lace veils of their own, proudly wearing them as echoes of the Queen's example. Even brides of more modest means aspired to copy Victoria's style. Though many could not afford silk or Huntington lace, they purchased simpler white fabrics, imitations of lace, or veils stitched by hand at home. The point was not to match the Queen stitch for stitch, but to participate in the symbolism she had created. White gowns and lace veils became a visual declaration of purity, loyalty, and the hope of lifelong union. Interestingly, lace also embodied contradiction. Though it symbolized purity and delicacy, it was one of the most labor-intensive textiles to produce. The women who made it often worked long hours for little pay, their eyes straining by lamplight, their hands weary from countless stitches. Lace may have represented virtue for the bride, but for the lace makers, it was survival. This duality was part of the Victorian world. Grandeur often rested upon the unseen labor of the poor. Yet even here, Victoria's gown had impact. By choosing Huntington lace, she revived a craft that might otherwise have faded into obscurity. In her veil, generations of lace makers found renewed purpose, their skills preserved through the desire of countless brides to imitate the Queen. Beyond economics, lace and purity became fused in the popular imagination. Wedding poems of the era described brides as wrapped in lace as virtue is wrapped in grace. Paintings depicted women in white gowns with veils trailing like clouds. To wear lace was to display one's virtue openly, in the same way a knight once displayed his armor. This new symbolism also shaped social expectations. A bride who chose not to wear white or lace might be subtly judged, her character questioned. Though the tradition had started with Victoria's personal choice, it quickly became a cultural standard, with its own pressures and assumptions. Brides were expected not only to marry but to embody purity in visible form. Yet, as much as it carried social weight, the lace veil also carried romance. The softness of the fabric, the way it caught the light, the gesture of lifting it at the altar, all these small details spoke to the tenderness of the moment. Even now, when brides lower veils across their faces, they are repeating gestures first given power in Victoria's time. Artists and writers were especially captivated. Painters produced sentimental canvases of white-gowned brides with flowing veils, while poets described lace as the cloud through which love's light shines. The popularity of such images reinforced the association of lace with beauty, virtue, and romance, ensuring its place in the visual language of weddings. Of course, not every bride could access true Huntington lace. Many turned to machine-made lace, cheaper and more widely available. While some criticized this as imitation, others embraced it as democratization, the spreading of royal fashion into middle-class homes. Lace, once the preserve of aristocrats, now appeared at parish weddings in small towns across England. This blending of aspiration and accessibility allowed Victoria's symbolism to endure. Lace became a fixture of weddings not because every bride could afford the Queen's veil, but because every bride could echo its meaning in some way. Even the humblest trimming carried a whisper of the royal gown. As the decades passed, the image of the lace veil became so tied to weddings that it seemed eternal, as though it had always been so. Few remembered that it had begun with one queen's decision. Such is the power of cultural adoption. Once an idea takes root, its origin fades, and it becomes tradition. Thus, lace came to embody more than artistry. It became memory, morality, and identity woven into fabric. For brides, it was a garment of virtue. For lace makers, it was livelihood. For society, it was a new tradition, one born not in ancient ritual, but in the quiet, personal choice of a queen on her wedding day. By the middle of the 19th century, only a decade after Queen Victoria's wedding, the image of the white gown and lace veil had already begun its transformation. What began as a single personal choice by a young queen had spread outward, shifting first into aristocratic circles, then into middle-class homes, and eventually into the expectations of society at large. Fashion, as you may imagine, is rarely just fabric and thread. It is a mirror of values, a language through which societies express what they believe about themselves. Victoria's gown, with its whiteness and lace, quickly became such a mirror. And as it did, what had once been an option became, slowly but surely, an expectation. At first, white gowns were a luxury, affordable only to the wealthy. Silk and handmade lace required both money and connections. Aristocratic brides, eager to emulate the queen, appeared at their weddings in white, each gown slightly different but clearly inspired by Victoria's understated style. Soon, engravings of these weddings filled magazines and newspapers, further normalizing the white dress as the proper attire for brides. But something interesting happened. As the idea gained momentum, the white gown ceased to be simply fashionable. It began to carry moral weight. Wearing white was no longer just about following a trend, it was about displaying purity, virtue, and respectability. This moral association was reinforced by an era preoccupied with appearances. The Victorian ideal of womanhood celebrated modesty, chastity, and quiet devotion. A white gown served as a public statement of these values, transforming personal clothing into social declaration. In towns and villages, brides in white were praised not just for beauty, but for virtue. Gradually, pressure mounted. Brides who chose other colors were sometimes criticized, as though their decision reflected a lack of virtue. Fashion columns urged women to embrace white, citing the Queen's example as both stylish and morally upright. What had begun as a personal choice became a cultural prescription. This transformation was not limited to Britain. As engravings, magazines, and gossip crossed the Atlantic, brides in America, Europe, and even colonial settings began adopting the white dress. Royal symbolism carried weight far beyond London, and Queen Victoria's influence, subtle yet profound, seeped into distant cultures. Middle-class families, too, began to imitate the tradition. Even when finances made it challenging. Many brides wore dresses of white cotton or muslin, simpler fabrics that could be dyed and reused after the ceremony. In this way, practicality merged with aspiration. A young woman might wear her white gown for the wedding, then carefully alter or recolor it for later use. This adaptability ensured the spread of the custom across classes. Even those who could not afford silk or lace could still participate in the symbolism of white. The gown became less about luxury and more about the gesture, the public display of virtue through clothing. As decades passed, however, the expectation hardened. What had once been a queen's choice and then a trend became tradition. And tradition is a powerful force. By the late 19th century, etiquette books declared that the proper bride wore white. To do otherwise was to risk whispers of impropriety. We might pause here to consider the subtle pressure this created. A bride's attire, once a personal matter, now carried the weight of societal expectation. To wear color was to stand out, and to stand out was often unwelcome in a society that prized conformity. White became not just a gown, but a uniform, gentle, beautiful, but also prescriptive. The symbolism also began to extend into photographs, a new technology of the age. Wedding portraits in white gowns, with lace veils trailing across the floor, became treasured keepsakes in family albums. These images reinforced the tradition, ensuring that future generations grew up seeing brides only in white, for Queen Victoria herself. The white gown had been a choice of modesty and patriotism. But for her subjects, it evolved into a social script. The Queen's personal sincerity became society's requirement. Brides who married without white might feel judged, or worse, forgotten in history's memory, for the white gown had become the visual shorthand of marriage itself. Yet, even within this prescription, brides found ways to express individuality. Some chose gowns with colored sashes, floral embroidery, or subtle tinted fabrics. Others used heirloom lace or veils borrowed from mothers and sisters, blending tradition with personal history. White may have been the standard, but within it, infinite variation flourished. The spread of the white gown also reflected the rise of print culture. Fashion magazines like the Queen and Godey's Ladies book published detailed sketches of bridal attire, praising the elegance of white satin and lace. Readers, inspired by these images, turned to local dressmakers to replicate the style as best they could. Slowly, the tradition became so entrenched that people forgot its origin. Brides wore white because their mothers had worn white, and their mothers before them. The memory of Victoria's choice blurred, as all powerful traditions eventually do. What mattered was not the Queen herself, but the expectation she had unwittingly set in motion. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the white gown was no longer optional. It was a cultural mandate, reinforced by etiquette, art, photography, and social expectation. The Queen's bold simplicity had become a binding tradition. And while it carried beauty and symbolism, it also carried quiet weight, the weight of conformity, and the unspoken pressure to embody an ideal. And yet, as you consider this transformation, there is also comfort in the way a single garment could unite so many people. From aristocrats to seamstresses, from small parish brides to those marrying in grand cathedrals, the white gown became a shared symbol. It told a story of love, purity, and new beginnings, a story whispered through lace and satin across generations. By the late 19th century, Queen Victoria's choice of a white gown had become firmly embedded in Britain. But traditions do not remain confined to borders. Through the slow but steady currents of empire, trade, print culture, and cultural aspiration, the white wedding dress began to travel far beyond London, weaving itself into the ceremonies of nations across the world. The story of its spread is one of both imitation and adaptation, of societies absorbing the symbol of purity, while blending it with their own local customs. The first ripple spread through Europe. Royal courts and aristocratic families on the continent were quick to follow Victoria's example, their brides appearing in white satin and lace. In France, Germany, and Russia, depictions of white-gowned brides began appearing in illustrated papers. Even monarchs, who once chose jeweled robes in their own national styles, adopted the softer whiteness introduced by England's young queen. In Germany, the symbolism carried added resonance. Prince Albert, after all, had been German, and Victoria's marriage was viewed as a bridge between nations. German brides embraced white gowns with lace veils, framing them as gestures not only of purity but also of modernity, aligning themselves with a new international standard. From Europe, the tradition crossed oceans. In the United States, the growing influence of illustrated magazines helped normalize the image of the white gown. Godey's Ladies book, one of the most widely read women's publications of the 19th century, repeatedly praised the elegance of white bridal attire, declaring it the most fitting hue for the sacredness of marriage. American brides, particularly those of middle and upper-class families, began adopting white gowns as their own. Some wore imported lace, while others turned to local seamstresses for more modest imitations. Yet the symbolism remained intact. To wear white was to participate in a tradition that now felt both royal and respectable. The white gown also spread through colonial ties. In India, Africa, and parts of Asia under British influence, missionary schools and colonial administrators promoted European customs, including white weddings. Churches often taught the association of white with virtue, framing it as both Christian and civilized. Yet, local communities adapted the custom in varied ways, sometimes combining white gowns with traditional jewelry or ceremonial fabrics. Japan presents a fascinating case. When the country opened more fully to the West in the late 19th century, Western fashions began to appear alongside ancient Shinto traditions. Japanese brides often wore both, a traditional shiromuku robe in pure white for Shinto ceremonies, followed by a Western-style white gown for Christian or Western receptions. In this way, the symbolism of white merged across cultures, deepening rather than replacing tradition. In Africa, similar adaptations occurred. Some brides incorporated white gowns into church weddings introduced by missionaries, but kept traditional fabrics and headpieces for family celebrations. The gown became one layer in a tapestry of cultural identity, honoring both imported and ancestral traditions. The spread was not simply about imitation of royalty. It was also about aspiration, modernity, and participation in a global culture. To wear a white gown was to signal that one belonged to the new world of international fashion, to join a symbolic community that transcended borders. By the end of the 19th century, the white gown was firmly established as a global tradition among Christian and Western-influenced weddings. Even in regions with their own strong bridal customs, the imagery of the white dress had become recognizable. It was a symbol that required no translation: purity, devotion, and new beginnings stitched into fabric. Yet, the adoption was not without nuance. In some communities, brides wore white only for photographs, while choosing traditional attire for the actual ceremony. In others, white gowns were reserved for wealthier families, becoming a subtle marker of class distinction. The gown could be both unifying and divisive, binding societies together in shared symbolism. While highlighting economic disparities, what is striking, however, is how swiftly the tradition settled into permanence. By the dawn of the 20th century, the image of the bride in white had become so common that it felt eternal. Few questioned its origins, fewer still remembered that it had begun with a single queen in 1840. The global spread also illustrates the power of imagery in the 19th century. Before film or television, engravings, lithographs, and photographs carried the visual weight of tradition. The white gown became iconic not only because it was worn, but because it was depicted, repeated in magazines, paintings, and photographs until it imprinted itself upon the collective imagination. In time, the gown would become so entwined with the very concept of marriage that it crossed boundaries even without colonial or missionary influence. When people imagined a wedding, they imagined a bride in white, her veil flowing like a cloud. And imagination has its own quiet way of reshaping reality. By the close of the 19th century, the white gown had spread to such an extent that it seemed universal, though its forms varied. Some gowns were lavish with silk and lace, others modest in cotton and muslin. Some were paired with crowns of flowers, others with traditional jewelry. Yet all carried the same essential message: a new life, begun in purity, wrapped in white. Thus, the gown was no longer merely Victoria's gown, or even Britain's tradition. It had become a global symbol, a garment that spoke across languages and customs, echoing quietly through churches, homes, and hearts. What began in London on a misty February morning now belonged to the world. The white gown, by the end of the 19th century, was no longer just a garment worn for a single morning. It had become a symbol, one that lived on in memory, in writing, and most importantly, in images. For while Queen Victoria had first shared her gown through painted portraits and engravings, the world of brides that followed her increasingly shared theirs through the lens of photography. The rise of photography changed not only how weddings were remembered, but how they were imagined. In still, monochrome prints, brides in white were frozen in time, their veils and bouquets preserved long after the moment had passed. The photograph turned the gown from fleeting fabric into enduring icon. Photography had, in its earliest days, been a difficult and expensive process. The daguerreotypes of the 1840s and 1850s required long exposures, and so brides sat stiffly, scarcely able to move. But as technology improved, portraits grew more natural. Couples could smile gently, hold bouquets, or even be pictured standing together. The result was that the white gown appeared more frequently, more accessibly, in more homes. Families displayed wedding portraits in parlors, on mantels, and within albums. The bride in white became not only a public figure in newspapers, but also a private presence in households everywhere. With photography came a subtle deepening of symbolism. The gown was no longer only about purity or devotion, it was also about permanence. A photograph of a bride was meant to be looked upon by children, grandchildren, even great-grandchildren. The dress, preserved in silver nitrate and paper, was a reminder of family beginnings, a quiet anchor in the stream of memory. Symbolism grew too in the details that photographs highlighted. Lace, embroidery, and delicate veils, details that might have been lost in words, were suddenly captured with precision. In the stillness of a print, one could linger upon the fine craftsmanship of a gown, the glint of pearls, or the shimmer of silk. These details elevated the gown to an object of artistry, not merely attire. It was also in this era that brides began to carry flowers more consistently. Photography immortalized bouquets, often simple clusters of orange blossoms or lilies, tied in satin ribbons. These images reinforced the symbolic pairing of purity, the gown, with fertility, the flowers, weaving layers of meaning into the bridal tableau. As the 19th century turned to the 20th, photography spread rapidly beyond the elite. Portable cameras and cheaper studio services made it possible for middle-class families, and even working-class households, to preserve wedding images. The white gown, therefore, became not only the attire of queens and aristocrats, but of seamstresses, farmers' daughters, and shopkeepers' brides. Wedding photography also deepened the gown's role as a unifying cultural symbol. Across Europe, America, and colonies abroad, people could now see what a wedding looked like, even if they could not attend. Photographs circulated among relatives, traveled in letters, or were displayed in local shops. The white gown became a shared visual language, instantly recognizable no matter the setting. It is worth pausing to imagine how these images appeared to those who had never seen such attire before. For villagers in remote regions, the arrival of a photograph showing a bride in white must have felt like glimpsing another world. The gown was no longer simply fabric, it was a window into modernity, a picture of what a wedding ought to be. The white gown thus gained layers of symbolism. It was purity, permanence, artistry, fertility, and modernity, all woven together. Its meaning grew not from any single wedding, but from the endless repetition of its image across thousands of households. Photography also shifted how brides themselves thought of the gown. For many, the knowledge that they would be photographed heightened the importance of the dress. It was not only for the eyes of the groom or the congregation, it was for generations yet unborn. The gown was chosen with the photograph in mind, a decision that gave it even greater symbolic weight. Even after the ceremony, photographs allowed brides to revisit the moment again and again. Long after the gown was stored away or repurposed, the image remained, unchanging, eternal. This permanence deepened the gown's role as a vessel of memory, a garment stitched not only with fabric but with time itself. The calm stillness of a photograph also lent the gown a dreamlike quality. Unlike the movement of real life, photographs froze the bride in an almost sacred stillness, as if she were not merely a person but an icon. In this way, the photograph amplified the symbolic aura of the gown, giving it a weight that exceeded its fabric. By the early 20th century, the combination of photography and tradition ensured that the white gown was no longer only a fashionable choice, it was expected. To marry without a photograph of a bride in white felt incomplete, as if something essential had been left out. The gown and the photograph had become inseparable, each reinforcing the meaning of the other. This intertwining of fabric and photograph is what gave the gown such enduring power. A dress may fade, lace may yellow, but the image endures. And in its endurance, the gown transcended time, carrying forward not only individual memories, but collective tradition. In reflecting upon this union of gown and image, we can see how the white wedding dress became more than attire. It became an archetype, a figure that lived within memory, within family lore, within the quiet permanence of sepia paper. Through photography, the gown achieved immortality, not of fabric, but of image. By the early 20th century, the white wedding gown was no longer simply a symbol of purity, permanence, or family memory. It had become a commodity, an article shaped, marketed, and sold within a growing global economy of fashion. What had begun with Queen Victoria's personal choice in 1840 had by now blossomed into an industry that would employ seamstresses, enrich fashion houses, and influence entire economies. The wedding dress had, in effect, become both ritual and business. In the 19th century, most brides' dresses were made at home or by local seamstresses. But as the white gown became universal, demand increased beyond what local makers could provide. Fashion houses, already rising in Paris and London, began to offer wedding gowns as part of their collections. Parisian couturiers such as Charles Frederick Worth and later Paul Poiret recognized that bridal attire was not simply clothing, it was a statement. To wear a gown designed in Paris was to join an international language of elegance. Brides who could afford it traveled or commissioned gowns from abroad, bringing prestige to their ceremonies. The wedding industry also began to feed upon itself. As photography grew more common, images of brides circulated more widely. These images served as advertisements in their own right, subtly persuading women that a gown should be more elaborate, more fashionable. More in keeping with what was seen in magazines or in the weddings of society families. The economic impact spread downward as well. Local seamstresses and dressmakers found steady work in copying Parisian designs for middle-class brides. Fabric merchants profited from the sale of white silks, satins, and cottons. Lace makers, in particular, experienced renewed demand, as bridal veils became almost as symbolic as the gowns themselves. Beyond fabric and fashion, other industries began to take root around the gown. Jewelers offered pearls, tiaras, and brooches specifically for brides. Florists advertised bouquets of lilies, roses, or orange blossoms as the essential bridal accessory. Even photographers advertised packages tailored to weddings, bundling gown and image together as inseparable. The expansion of consumer culture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries reinforced this trend. Department stores, new palaces of shopping, dedicated entire sections to weddings. Brides could order gowns, veils, gloves, shoes, and flowers in one place, transforming marriage into a commercial ritual as much as a personal one. This commercialization also democratized the gown. No longer was it necessary to commission from Paris, catalogs offered affordable versions for provincial brides. By the 1920s, companies like Sears in America advertised ready-made wedding gowns, shipped by mail, allowing brides even in remote towns to participate in the tradition. The fashion houses, however, still held symbolic authority. Haute couture dictated the silhouettes, whether corseted, flowing, or column-like, that department stores and catalogs would imitate. Thus, even brides far from Paris found themselves shaped by the decisions of a handful of designers. By the interwar years, the wedding industry had grown into a recognizable economic force. Newspapers carried announcements not just of who married whom, but of what the bride wore, and often who made it. A gown could enhance a family's prestige, becoming a public marker of refinement and status. It is striking to consider how an item once chosen for simplicity, Victoria's plain satin dress, decorated only with lace, had evolved into an engine of economic activity. What had been a quiet statement of modesty now sustained industries of fabric, jewelry, photography, flowers, and media. One can also sense how the economic weight deepened the gown's symbolism. It was no longer just about purity, it was also about investment, about sacrifice, about the family's dedication to beginning married life with dignity and grace. The gown became a financial gesture as much as a personal one. The fashion press reinforced this notion. Articles described not only gowns, but also the cost of fabrics, the prestige of certain lace makers, and the artistry of designers. In this way, the gown was elevated beyond dressmaking into cultural capital. A family's standing could be measured by the care and expense devoted to a wedding gown. The growing wedding industry also had a psychological impact. Brides felt not only social but economic pressure to conform, to invest, to ensure their gown was good enough. Yet, in this, the gown acquired yet another layer of symbolism. It was a sacrifice, a visible sign of a family's devotion to the bride's future. By the mid-20th century, weddings had become among the most economically significant life events, rivaled only by funerals. And at the heart of this economy sat the gown, no longer only fabric and lace, but a catalyst for industries, a vessel of meaning, and a marker of both love and capital. In reflecting upon this, one sees how Queen Victoria's personal choice blossomed into something far greater than she could have imagined. The gown had become a bridge between ritual and commerce, between sentiment and economy, between love and livelihood. The white wedding gown, first chosen by Queen Victoria in 1840, has traveled far, across continents, through industries, and into the lives of millions of women. Yet, its greatest power is not in commerce or fashion, but in memory. For it has become a garment that holds not only the stories of queens and couturiers, but also of countless families, each attaching their own meaning to its folds of fabric. When we reflect upon the white gown today, we find it standing at the intersection of history and intimacy. It is at once a global symbol and a deeply personal one. It connects strangers across nations, and yet it belongs uniquely to the bride who wears it. This dual nature, both universal and personal, is what has allowed the gown to endure. The gown's legacy lives most vividly in family stories. A photograph in a frame, a folded dress in a cedar chest, a scrap of lace kept in a drawer, these items are not only textiles or images, but vessels of memory. They preserve the moment when two lives intertwined, when families were joined, when a new chapter began. For many, the gown is also an inheritance. Mothers passed their dresses to daughters, sometimes to be worn again, sometimes simply to be admired. Each gown becomes part of a lineage, layered with generations of meaning. To touch such fabric is to touch not only cloth, but time itself. The gown also provides comfort. In a world of shifting fashions and fleeting trends, the white dress remains constant, a reassuring anchor of continuity. To know that brides in the present wear what brides in the past once wore is to feel connected across the gulf of years. It is a quiet reminder that, though times change, some rituals remain steadfast. Even when the gown changes shape, from crinolines to slim sheaths, from lace sleeves to strapless bodices, the essence remains. The symbolism of purity, of new beginnings, of devotion, still clings to the color white. In this way, the gown demonstrates that traditions can evolve without losing their heart. At the same time, memory grants the gown a flexibility that fashion alone cannot. Each bride remembers her dress differently, some for its beauty, some for its imperfections, some for the emotions it held. The gown becomes not only what it is, but also what it represents: love, hope, family, faith. This power of memory is why the gown resonates even in stories where it is never worn. Brides who could not afford a white gown, or who chose traditional attire instead, often still recall what such a gown meant to them: the dream, the image, the symbol. In this way, the gown belongs not only to those who wear it, but also to those who imagine it. The gown's endurance is also linked to comfort in repetition. Rituals soothe the human mind, offering familiarity amid uncertainty. The act of wearing white, repeated across generations, creates a sense of shared rhythm. A bride today may not know Queen Victoria's story, yet she participates unconsciously in the continuity Victoria began. At the level of culture, the gown serves as a reminder of the enduring human desire to mark beginnings with beauty. From ancient garlands to embroidered robes, societies across time have dressed brides in symbolic attire. The white gown is one chapter in this universal story, distinguished only by its reach and its resonance. It is worth remembering too that traditions endure not because they are imposed, but because they offer meaning. The white gown continues to be chosen not out of obligation, but because it comforts, reassures, and inspires. It whispers of connection, of family, of continuity, a garment that is more than fabric, more even than fashion. This is perhaps the gown's final gift: it encourages stillness. Weddings may be joyful and bustling, but the gown invites a pause. To see a bride in white is to stop for a moment, to breathe, to recognize the significance of the threshold being crossed. It is a reminder that beginnings matter, and that beauty can sanctify even the simplest of moments. In our own time, when traditions are often questioned, the white gown endures precisely because it adapts. Some brides wear gowns of ivory or blush, some pair white dresses with cultural garments, some choose not to wear white at all. Yet the presence of the tradition, whether embraced, altered, or set aside, remains a point of reference. It gives context, and in giving context, it comforts. Thus, as we consider the gown's legacy, we see not rigidity but resilience. A tradition that began with one queen has become infinitely varied, yet still recognizable. Its memory, stitched into fabric and photograph, endures not because it was forced upon us, but because it continues to offer meaning. And so, as you rest now, perhaps you can imagine the gown not only as fabric, but as a gentle thread connecting you to the past. A reminder that traditions, when chosen freely, can bring comfort, stability, and peace. The white gown may have begun as a fashion choice, but it has endured as something greater, a symbol of continuity, memory, and quiet beauty. In this way, the gown's story is not only about history, it is about presence. About how one small choice ripples outward, carried through generations, and still rests gently in the rituals of today. From a queen in 1840, to brides across the world now, the white gown has become a legacy of calm permanence. Another whisper from the past, now fading into the night. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more sleepy stories from history. And until next time,